Curves is one of the most powerful image adjustment tools in all of After Effects or Photoshop for that matter. So let's go ahead and apply curves to our Magic Mountain footage. I'm going to resize this so I can see this better. I chose this footage specifically because there are some luminance issues. We don't get too dark, we don't get too light, so there's not too much contrast, and curves is perfect for that. Curves does have its downsides. It does have a pretty steep learning curve, and also there's no visual readout. So when we apply an effect like levels, which we'll talk about later in this chapter, we get kind of this readout called a histogram that describes our image. But when we're using curves, we don't have any such benefit per se. But it is still extremely powerful. Let me show you how this tiny little 4x4 graph can do so much for a piece of footage. Here's how this graph reads. Here from left to right, on the bottom left corner here, we have the darkest part of the image, and on the right we have the brightest part of the footage. And then we have the same thing from bottom to top on the left-hand side. And by default, the brightest point is mapped to the brightest point, and the darkest point is mapped to the darkest point, and etc. And so that's why we have this straight line here. But if we were to take this spot of brightness right here and drag it up, it'd be like saying, I want to remap this area of brightness to this area of brightness. That seems like a subtle change, but there's actually 255 degrees of luminance here. So when you move it up just a little bit like that, you're actually increasing the brightness quite a bit. Now, we definitely brightened it, but what about the shadow areas? Well, we could come down here to the left side of the curve, which represents shadow areas, and click and drag it down below its initial point. That will deepen or bring out the shadows. It still looks kind of washed out, but if I take off this effect and turn it back on, we can see that we've actually added a lot of punch and contrast to this. And what we could also do is come in here to some midtones and maybe darken those as well. Bring out some of the texture in the mountain. Now you want to be really careful you don't ever get any horizontal lines. Watch this as I start dragging this down. This looks good, but then it starts posterizing because we have this horizontal line here. And it's a little bit more obvious even if we go below another point. So you got to be really careful. It's possible to do all sorts of zany things like this with curves that aren't super attractive or good, unless you're going for like some kind of crazy stylized effect or whatever. I'm just going to go ahead and reset the effect. Again, we're going to talk about levels coming up here in just a bit. And basically, they both kind of do similar things, and so they often are compared to each other. But here's the difference. Levels has 3 sliders: highlights, midtones, shadows, and that's it. I mean, there's a few other things you can do down here, but pretty much that's what levels is. It's highlights, midtones, and shadows. But with curves, we have this entire line that represents the entire spectrum. So if we want to remap this tiny little highlight to be a little bit higher and remap the highlight next to it to be a little bit darker, well, we can do that. We have control over this entire curve. So we can click to set control points. And then as we move a control point like this, we could fine tune just that spot. See what's happening there? Doesn't look super hot, but if I start playing with it, you can see that I have such finite control over how this works. Now in Photoshop, there's these gradients along the bottom and the left side. They kind of steer you. They're like guides as you're moving these points around. And there's no such frame of reference in After Effects, which is kind of a bummer. The good news is that you can actually save presets for curves, and you can actually load them as well. So if you save a curve, let's say like this curve is like the perfect curve for my digital photos or digital camera or whatever, and I click save in Photoshop and it creates, I believe, an ACV file. Then I could bring that in here in curves by clicking this open button, and then it's looking for a Photoshop curves file. So they basically can exchange information in this way. Also, if you want to manually create a curve, you can click the pencil and just manually draw some like crazy curve, and then it usually comes out really wacky. So it's typically best if you're looking for a realistic effect just to use these nodes. Let me reset this here. And then to manually just go in and adjust those as you see fit. Now, if you've been watching me as I've been playing around with some of these nodes, you can tell that curves is very sensitive. Just a little bit often does the trick. So if I bring this area up a little bit, you can see that I am adjusting the bottom of the image here, the city there. And you can see the difference that that makes. So if I wanted to get rid of the detail here, I bring this down, it just wipes it out completely. And if I bring this up, then we see more highlights and details in the shadow areas. So again, that's the benefit of curves, where we can look at the highlights and really get specific with any degree of the highlights, any degree of the midtones, or any degrees of the shadows with curves. Now, one final thing, I'm just going to click reset here. We can adjust each individual channel on its own. We could use this for some really cool effects. Let's go to, let's say, for example, the blue channel. There we go. And if I want to take the highlights down to the blue channel, I can create this really washed out 70s kind of effect with the yellow tint. Because keep in mind, the opposite of blue is yellow. So as we reduce the amount of blue lights in the highlights, we're actually making those highlights yellow, which creates a kind of eerie, rustic effect. Or maybe our image has a blue color cast. So we might want to go over to the red channel and give that whole entire thing a big boost. So as you can see, although there is a learning curve, Curves does give you a lot of flexibility when you're trying to adjust individual sections or areas of a luminance curve.